The year is 2035. You're an American tourist traveling through Europe. You start your day in Paris enjoying a fresh croissant in a bustling cafe. Then, you jump on a Hyperloop and head to Rome for lunch. By the evening, you're sipping a cold beer in Berlin. The journey is fast, smooth, and efficient, everything you expected from Europe. The streets are clean. The architecture is stunning. Everywhere you look, there are signs of history and culture. But something feels off. The streets are quiet, and the cafes are full, but mostly with elderly people. The younger crowd seems absent. When you try to buy a souvenir, you realize something strange. The shop isn't owned by a local, but rather by a foreign company. In fact, as you look around, you notice that entire city blocks, ports, and even the energy grid are controlled by foreign corporations. Europe doesn't feel like the superpower it once was. It feels like a museum, a beautiful, historic place frozen in time, but with little sign of growth or innovation. This isn't the Europe you expected. Once known for its high standard of living, excellent healthcare, and rich history, it now seems like a shadow of its former self. In 2008, the economies of the European Union and the United States were roughly equal in size. Europe was even slightly ahead. Fast forward to today, and that gap has widened significantly. The U.S. economy has surged to over $27 trillion, while Europe's economy barely surpasses $17 trillion. The gap between them is so wide now that it is equivalent to the entire size of Japan's economy. So how did this happen? How did a continent that once thrived economically, culturally, and politically fall so far behind? Spoiler alert: it wasn't an accident. In fact, Europe's economic decline can be traced back to a series of fatal decisions. Over the next few segments, we'll explore 6 major reasons behind Europe's economic struggles, starting with the decline of its industrial base. Germany, once the beating heart of Europe's economy, is facing a crisis. For decades, Germany's economy relied heavily on its manufacturing sector. The country built its wealth on producing cars, chemicals, and machines, the very things that powered Europe and the world. The formula seemed simple and effective: rely on American security for protection, sell cars to a growing Chinese market, and use cheap Russian gas to power the factories. This strategy worked for a long time. Germany became a global leader in manufacturing, with companies like Volkswagen, BASF, and Siemens leading the charge. However, this all changed when the Nord Stream pipelines were destroyed. This wasn't just a physical explosion, it symbolized the collapse of Germany's entire business model. Without cheap Russian gas, Germany's factories couldn't survive. Let's take a closer look at BASF, the world's largest chemical producer. BASF produces chemicals found in everyday items, from toothpaste to cars. The company's headquarters in Ludwigshafen is so large that it's almost like a small city within a city. But in 2024, BASF made a shocking decision that would impact the entire German economy. They shut down major production lines in Germany. Why? Because producing chemicals requires enormous amounts of energy. And with the loss of Russian gas, energy prices skyrocketed. Instead of staying in Germany, BASF decided to invest $10 billion in a new factory in Shenzhen, China. The irony is hard to ignore. Germany, a country known for its commitment to human rights and environmental standards, was forcing its companies to move to China, where environmental regulations are far less strict, and coal is burned in massive quantities just to keep the lights on. This wasn't an isolated case. In December 2024, Germany's industrial production reached its lowest level since the 2020 lockdowns. The signs of deindustrialization were everywhere. Factories were closing, workers were being laid off, and the future of Europe's industrial base looked uncertain. Germany's energy crisis wasn't just caused by the loss of Russian gas. It was also a result of the country's rushed transition to green energy. Germany closed its last 3 nuclear power plants in 2023, believing that renewable energy sources like wind and solar would fill the gap. However, this move backfired. When the energy crisis hit, Germany turned to coal plants to keep the lights on, effectively undoing its efforts to become a leader in green energy. This shift from nuclear power to coal was a tragic irony. Germany, once a leader in environmental sustainability, was now using the dirtiest fossil fuel to meet its energy needs. The failure of Germany's green energy transition is just one part of a larger European problem. The continent's reliance on intermittent renewable energy sources, without enough investment in energy storage or grid infrastructure, left it vulnerable to price fluctuations and instability. While Europe was struggling with high energy prices and unreliable renewable energy, countries like the United States were benefiting from cheaper, domestically produced natural gas. The U.S. shale revolution had made energy costs lower in America, giving its factories a significant advantage over European ones. In 2023 and 2024, European industries were paying 3 to 4 times more for electricity than their counterparts in the US and China. This made it nearly impossible for European companies to compete on a global scale. The energy crisis wasn't just limited to industry. Ordinary citizens in countries like Germany and the UK found themselves struggling to pay their heating bills. Energy poverty became a real issue, with families forced to choose between heating their homes and putting food on the table. Europe's energy grid, once a symbol of stability, had become a patchwork of instability, thanks to the continent's over-reliance on renewable energy. Europe's green energy dream is one of the most ironic stories of the 21st century. The continent pushed for a transition to clean, renewable energy, but its reliance on Russian gas and a lack of infrastructure to support renewable energy sources has left it vulnerable to crisis. Germany, once the symbol of environmental progress, now burns coal to meet its energy needs, all while China continues to build new coal plants at a rapid pace. What happened to Europe's green vision? It's clear that the transition to renewable energy was poorly planned and executed. Instead of creating a reliable energy system, Europe created an unstable one. The promise of cheap, clean energy has turned into a nightmare of high prices and energy shortages. While Europe focused on cutting emissions by a fraction of a percentage point, the rest of the world, particularly China, continued to burn fossil fuels at an alarming rate. As we continue to explore Europe's economic decline, we see that it isn't just industrial factors or energy crises that have weakened the continent. There are deeper, slower-moving issues at play, issues that affect the very foundation of Europe's future, its people. Let's begin with one of the most critical challenges: Europe's demographic crisis. Imagine being a 25-year-old in Italy. You've just graduated from university, full of hope and ambition. But when you look around, opportunities seem scarce. Jobs are hard to come by. Rent is expensive, and the cost of living is rising. You're forced to live with your parents even though you've worked hard to get your degree. And there's one more thing: your country's birth rate is plummeting. In 2024, Italy's birth rate hit a historic low of 1.18 children per woman. For context, a country needs a birth rate of 2.1 children per woman just to replace its population. Anything below 1.5 children per woman is considered a demographic emergency. At 1.18, Italy is facing the very real risk of population decline. And if this trend continues, it could lead to the country's eventual extinction. Italy isn't alone. The entire European Union is facing a demographic crisis, with many countries experiencing birth rates below replacement level. In places like Spain, Greece, and Portugal, the problem is even worse. The implications of this decline are far-reaching. Fewer young people means a shrinking workforce, which in turn means fewer people paying taxes to support the elderly population. The situation is particularly troubling because of Europe's pension systems. In many countries, pensions are based on a pay-as-you-go system, where the money from current workers is used to pay the pensions of retirees. This system worked well when there were many workers for each retiree. In the 1960s, there were 4 workers for every retiree. But by 2050, some European countries will have fewer than 2 workers for every retiree. This means that in the future, the burden on the younger generation will be enormous. Take Italy as an example. The country has an aging population, and the government expects younger Italians to pay for the pensions of the older generations. But here's the catch. As the younger generation faces a stagnant economy, high unemployment, and the high cost of living, they're leaving in droves. Instead of staying to pay taxes and support the pension system, many young Italians are choosing to emigrate to places like the US, Australia, and Switzerland, where opportunities seem better. This outflow of young people creates a vicious cycle. As more and more young people leave, the tax base shrinks. To make up for the shortfall, the government raises taxes on the remaining young people, making it even harder for them to stay. And as taxes rise, more young people leave. This cycle continues, and Europe's future becomes even more uncertain. The political reality in Europe is that older generations hold most of the political power. In many countries, voters over the age of 60 make up a significant portion of the electorate. These voters, who rely on pensions, are understandably resistant to changes in the pension system. If a politician suggests cutting pension benefits or raising the retirement age, they risk losing votes. At the same time, Europe is hesitant to embrace large-scale immigration as a solution to the demographic crisis. While immigrants could help fill the workforce gap, there's a cultural backlash against immigration in many European countries. Political leaders are afraid to make the necessary changes because they know it could cost them the support of voters. As a result, Europe is stuck in a political gridlock, unable to make the tough decisions needed to address its demographic problems. As Europe struggles with its demographic issues, another problem is emerging: capital flight. Simply put, money is leaving Europe, and it's heading to places like the United States. The reasons for this are rooted in the differences between European and American financial systems. In the United States, the stock market is a powerful tool for growth. A large portion of American households own stocks, and the financial system is designed to help companies raise capital quickly and efficiently. European financial markets, on the other hand, are less developed, and fewer people invest in stocks. In fact, in many European countries, only a small percentage of the population owns stocks. As a result, European companies have a harder time raising capital to fund growth. Let's look at a case study: ARM Holdings. ARM is a British company that designs the technology behind almost every smartphone chip on the planet. Despite its immense value, when ARM decided to list on the stock market in 2023, it chose to list on the Nasdaq in the United States rather than the London Stock Exchange. This decision wasn't about patriotism. It was about access to capital. The U.S. stock market is deeper, more liquid, and more attractive to investors. Even European companies that do well in their home countries are often choosing to list on U.S. stock exchanges. Companies like Spotify, BioNTech, and Birkenstock all trade on the Nasdaq or the New York Stock Exchange, not on European exchanges. This means that the capital that could be used to fund European innovation is flowing out of the continent, contributing to Europe's economic decline. Another key factor in Europe's decline is its inability to innovate at the same pace as the United States and China. While Europe has historically been a leader in science and technology, the continent has failed to keep up with the digital revolution. The reality is that Europe has become a digital colony of the United States. Let's start with the basics. When was the last time you heard of a European smartphone? Nokia is a distant memory, and Ericsson is no longer a dominant force. Europe doesn't have its own major social media platforms or search engines. The tech giants of today, Apple, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Tesla, are all American companies. These companies dominate the global market and shape the future of technology. Europe's failure to create its own tech giants is largely due to its overregulation of the tech industry. While Silicon Valley has been pouring billions into artificial intelligence, Europe has been busy drafting laws to regulate AI before it even had a successful AI company to regulate. The European Union has focused on regulating the tech industry rather than fostering innovation. As a result, European startups are stifled by red tape and fail to grow to the scale necessary to compete with American and Chinese companies. Take the example of Mistral AI, a French startup that was once Europe's best hope to compete with OpenAI. Instead of focusing entirely on developing AI models, Mistral AI had to spend a huge amount of time and resources navigating the complex maze of European regulations. Including GDPR, the Digital Markets Act, and the Digital Services Act. This regulatory burden made it much harder for European startups to scale and compete globally. The failure to create new tech companies is a major problem for Europe. The digital economy is the future, and Europe is missing out. While the United States continues to lead in innovation, Europe is falling behind. The combined market value of companies like Apple, Google, and Amazon is greater than the entire stock market value of the UK, France, Germany, and Italy combined. That's a staggering statistic. The companies that are shaping the future of technology are not European. To make matters worse, when European companies do manage to innovate, they often get bought out by American firms. DeepMind, the AI lab that was originally founded in London, was bought by Google. Skype, the video calling platform that started in Estonia, was acquired by Microsoft. This trend of European startups being bought out by American companies is a reflection of Europe's inability to build and maintain its own tech giants. As we dive into the final part of our analysis on Europe's decline, we'll look at the external and internal challenges that are accelerating the continent's fall. While we've already explored issues like industrial decline, demographic shifts, and lack of innovation, there are other critical factors at play: Europe's energy crisis, its growing geopolitical challenges, and its weakened military position. These factors are making it harder for Europe to compete with the rest of the world. One of the most pressing issues that Europe faces today is its energy crisis. Over the past few decades, Europe has invested heavily in transitioning to renewable energy sources like wind, solar, and hydropower. While these investments were meant to reduce the continent's dependence on fossil fuels and help combat climate change, they've come with unintended consequences that have left Europe vulnerable. At the heart of Europe's energy crisis is the continent's reliance on natural gas, particularly from Russia. For many years, Europe enjoyed cheap Russian gas, which powered homes, factories, and industries. But when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the supply of gas was severely disrupted, and the illusion that Europe could rely on cheap energy sources collapsed. As a result, Europe faced skyrocketing energy prices, which impacted both businesses and ordinary citizens. In an effort to reduce its reliance on fossil fuels, Europe decided to push for a rapid transition to green energy. The European Union set ambitious goals to reduce carbon emissions and shift to renewable energy sources. The idea was to invest heavily in wind, solar, and other renewable technologies to meet energy demands while reducing environmental impact. However, the transition to green energy has not been smooth. While renewable energy sources are crucial for the future, they come with their own set of challenges. The problem with renewable energy is that it is intermittent. Wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. This means that the energy generated by renewable sources can't always be relied upon when demand is high. To fill the gaps, Europe continued to rely on natural gas, particularly from Russia, until that source was cut off. When that happened, Europe was left scrambling. Some countries turned to coal, one of the dirtiest energy sources, to keep the lights on. Others found themselves at the mercy of higher prices for liquefied natural gas, LNG imports, many of which came from the United States. These higher energy costs made it difficult for European businesses to compete with companies in other parts of the world, particularly the US and China, where energy costs were significantly lower. The energy crisis also had political consequences. As energy prices surged, many European citizens found themselves facing energy poverty. In countries like the UK and Germany, people had to choose between heating their homes and putting food on the table. This created widespread frustration and anger among the population. Political leaders, already struggling with the economic decline, faced growing pressure from citizens who were upset by rising energy costs. Governments in Europe were forced to implement subsidies and price caps to try to alleviate the financial burden on their citizens. But these measures were not enough to solve the deeper problem: Europe's energy dependency on external sources. In the long term, Europe's failure to establish energy independence has weakened its position on the global stage. While countries like the US and China continue to invest in new energy technologies and secure their own energy resources, Europe remains vulnerable to price fluctuations and geopolitical tensions. This energy insecurity has made Europe less competitive and more dependent on external actors. While energy insecurity is a major problem, Europe's geopolitical struggles are also playing a critical role in its decline. Over the past several decades, Europe has become increasingly divided on the global stage. The continent that once led the world in diplomacy, trade, and military power is now struggling to maintain influence in a world that is rapidly changing. The most significant shift in Europe's global standing has been its relationship with the United States. For much of the 20th century, Europe relied on the US for security and political leadership. The US was the protector of Europe, ensuring its safety through NATO and other international organizations. In return, Europe focused on economic growth, welfare programs, and social stability. But today, the political landscape has shifted. The US has become more focused on its own interests, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, while Europe has become more isolated. This shift was highlighted by the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, which left Europe to face its own security challenges without the support it had long relied on. Meanwhile, China has emerged as a major global power. As China continues to grow economically and militarily, Europe finds itself caught in the middle. While Europe is trying to balance its relationships with both the US and China, It's clear that the continent has lost some of its former influence. The rise of China and other emerging powers, coupled with the decline of Europe's industrial and military capabilities, has made it harder for Europe to maintain its position as a global leader. Perhaps the most concerning aspect of Europe's decline is its military vulnerability. For decades, Europe enjoyed what is known as the peace dividend, the idea that it could focus on social welfare programs, economic growth, and political stability while relying on the United States for military security. However, as the geopolitical landscape shifts and Europe faces new security threats, it is becoming painfully clear that the continent's military capabilities have been neglected. NATO, the military alliance that has long protected Europe, is becoming less effective as tensions rise between Russia, China, and the West. While NATO remains strong, Europe's individual military forces have been weakened over the years. Many European countries have significantly reduced their defense budgets, and some military units are outdated or underfunded. In a high-intensity conflict, Europe's military forces would struggle to compete with countries like the US or China. The British Army, for example, would run out of ammunition in just 2 days if it were engaged in a major conflict. The German military isn't much better. The reality is that Europe has neglected its defense for so long that it is now at a disadvantage. In terms of military readiness and capability, this decline in military power is also linked to Europe's demographic problems. With a shrinking population and fewer young people entering the military, Europe's ability to defend itself in the future looks uncertain. The continent's aging population means that there are fewer people available to serve in the armed forces, further weakening Europe's defense capabilities. For years, Europe has relied on the United States for military protection. This allowed European governments to invest heavily in social welfare programs, healthcare, and pensions, rather than spending money on defense. But as security threats continue to grow, Europe is realizing that it can no longer afford to ignore its military needs. The war in Ukraine has been a wake-up call for Europe. As Russia continues to assert its power in Eastern Europe, many European leaders have realized that they need to invest more in their own defense. This shift in priorities has led to a renewed focus on military spending. But the problem is that Europe is late to the game. While the US and China have been investing heavily in new military technologies, Europe has been focused on other priorities. The question now is, can Europe afford to modernize its military in time to face the growing threats on the horizon? The answer is uncertain. With a shrinking economy, rising taxes, and a shrinking tax base, it's difficult to see how Europe will be able to fund the military buildup it needs to remain secure. Europe's energy crisis, geopolitical struggles, and military challenges are contributing to the continent's decline. The energy crisis has left Europe vulnerable to price fluctuations and geopolitical tensions, while its military weaknesses have made it less secure in an increasingly unstable world. Europe's growing dependence on external powers and its failure to modernize its defense capabilities have made it harder for the continent to maintain its global influence. But there is still hope. Europe has the potential to turn things around if it can make the necessary reforms. A renewed focus on innovation, investment in green energy, and a more unified approach to defense could help Europe regain its footing on the world stage. However, the path to recovery will be long and difficult. In the coming years, Europe will face tough decisions. Will it embrace the changes needed to secure its future, or will it continue down the path of decline? Only time will tell. But for now, Europe remains at a crossroads, struggling to find its place in a rapidly changing world.